Hi, everyone. I hope everyone's here. We have 37 participants currently. Assume no one's in the queue, or Mark will let everyone in. Welcome to our third annual session that we're running in the UK, but we of course open to everyone. And if you are party to our social media, Facebook PALB2 Warriors group, so I invited everyone who is in that group to participate in the call, and I hope you'll find it as useful as in the previous years. So this year we have slightly different agenda, but also focusing very much on the developments in PALB2 research and risk management. If Mark, you can go to the next page, I'll show the agenda and what it's going to comprise itself, and I'll do the introductions shortly after. So I'm Yulia Baynham. I'm a PALB2 carrier. I've had unfortunate diagnosis of breast cancer in 2019, where I first learned I was carrying the gene, which I didn't know anything about. My doctor team had very limited knowledge, and that really led me to do a lot of research, joining the group, which at that point had 300 people only, now it's 2,000. And all the roads led to Marc and Andrew and Vishak and the team. And then I started to learn and get more involved in the genetic side, which really at that point helped me with making decisions around my surgery and my treatment plan, and also sparkled my big interest in overall genetics. And I'm doing quite a bit of work in the sort of cancer-related world currently. As the trustee of the cancer charity, and also involved with Marc in the CanRisk program led by University of Cambridge. So it's a short intro of me, because I'll be introducing everyone else shortly. So what we're going to cover today will be focused on the latest development in PALB2 research and risk management. So we have Marc leading that session with comments from Andrew. I'm super excited that this year we also have two PALB2 carriers, Joanna, Callaghan and Donna on the call, who will share their personal journeys and also what are they doing currently in terms of either raising awareness or looking at the emotional side of it. So doing really, really interesting things and quite inspired by what they do. So we'll give them enough room to share with everyone how they have approached the whole, what the experience was like and what they're doing now. We also received quite a lot of questions through PALB2 Warriors, about 18. So we're going to actually go through all of them. I grouped them up into themes, and Marc and Andrew and us will answer every question, and we'll open the floor to questions from everyone on the call. Please do put them into the chat as we go, and also I'll briefly tell you about other resources and information you can find. Of course, we are in the UK, so the talk will be from the UK perspective, but I'm sure many elements are global and applicable to everywhere, and there are international guidelines for PALB2 management, which Marc will touch on, but they were published last year. So hope that sets the scene. If you can go to the next page, I think I have covered that actually in what you just said. So we won't spend time on that, the objectives of the session. And we'll go straight to the introductions, which is the next page, Marc. Thank you. So who do we have on the call today? We have Professor Marc Tischkowitz, very welcome, who is Professor of Medical Genetics and is based at the University of Cambridge. Marc is an accomplished researcher, and he, in simple words, he is the one to go for anything on PALB2 in the UK, and I must say globally. So amazing. Marc also has founded PALB2 interest group. So it's the, you can find it on the website, where Marc connects with his equivalents in all the countries around the world. So it's very much a group that connects together on a regular basis, and we're always happy to help, or he is very happy to help to connect you with your local specialist if you don't know who they are. So we had quite a few queries from that. So Marc, thank you so much for again being very much at the center of the panel here. Next is Dr. Andrew Kulkarni. Andrew is a consultant clinical geneticist and the lead for cancer genetics service at Guy's Hospital in London. Andrew leads multidisciplinary teams. She also covers BRCA1, BRCA2 gene mutation carrier work, as well as the PALB2. And she's got several regional and national roles in terms of leading UK council member of the UK Cancer Genetics Group and the medical advisor to the UK Genetic Counselling Registration Board. All quite complicated, but Andrew is up there with the stars in the UK on the genetics side. I've done my intros already, so I'll go to Joanna and Donna. They will do, of course, a bit more when they talk about their journeys, but Joanna is a filmmaker based in Sussex. She is both Joanna and Donna, as I mentioned, PALB2 carriers, and they're doing some interesting projects. Donna recently, and her sister Jade, if Jade's on the call, welcome Jade, have been quite public, and you might have seen those who follow Breast Cancer Now take over the Instagram account for a day and share their journeys, and also been in many papers, maybe a bit more of Angelina Jolie or more of that coming to the UK. It would be brilliant. Here we go. Let's go to the next slide. Yeah, just wanted to point out that what we're doing with every session, we are building on the previous one. So first session was led 2 years ago, and we covered very much into detail what is PALB2, what is the basics of the genetics. We do replay some of it from year on year to what's the clinical management, etc. So we're not covering this in detail today because all of this can be found on YouTube when you type in PALB2 information session, or actually found through the PALB2 interest group. And last year, we also talked about new targeted therapies. We had Professor Andrew Tutt coming in the panel and talk about PARP inhibitors, also very much live information and current. Please do and look at that section of the video from the last year's call. And we are very pleased to have developed a very good informative booklet for PALB2 carriers in the UK, which you've got a screenshot on this page. Again, found through the PALB2 interest group, and I posted it through the Facebook a number of times. Very much everything you need to know about PALB2 as the carrier or a family member, you can find in that booklet. And just to point out another screenshot, here is the clinical risk management guidelines for PALB2 global, published in May last year. It's a very much go-to guide for clinical specialists in terms of risks, etc., that been agreed by the group with Marc very much in the center of it. If we go to the next page, just some ground rules here. Not really want to spend too much time on the slide, but of course we're respectful of each other. It's private information here, very much UK, but I mentioned we are welcoming everyone from other territories and countries joining this session today. We'll provide some guidance. Of course, we can't provide you specialist medical advice, so please do listen as much as you can. And if there is any specific questions to your personal circumstances, please do refer to your specialists in your countries. And as I mentioned, any Q&As, please drop them in the chat or ask them towards the end, because we'll try to go through all the information as effectively as we can. I think we're ready to start. If there are any questions, please voice out now, so we can, or I can hand over to Marc.
Thank you very much, Yulia, and thank you for that wonderful introduction, and many thanks to you for organising this information session. You've really been amazing in getting us all organised to do this. Good evening, everybody. My name is Marc Tischkowitz. I've already been introduced by Yulia. The first bit of this session today is going to be the hard work session, and I'm going to give you a bit of information about some new areas in PALB2 that you might be interested in. It's a bit more heavy, a bit more scientific, but you've got Donna and Joanna to look forward to after my presentation. So bear with it. Make a cup of tea if you're not so interested in the science bits, but hopefully I can make it interesting for you. Good. Okay. So I was going to really focus on 3 areas where there have been some new developments, and these are actually areas that I often get asked questions about as well. So I think that's why I focused on them. And I'm also expecting that you do have some previous knowledge. So I'm not going to go right back to the beginning. If you need more basic information, then please do look at the other two information sessions that we did last year and the year before that, because they will fill you in for the gaps that you might have. So the first question I was going to ask, or explain to you a bit about, is what types of breast cancer do you get in PALB2 compared to BRCA1 and BRCA2 carriers? And this comes up quite a lot. We didn't really know the answer very much until fairly recently. So just for some of you may not know that there are many different types of breast cancer. And if you want to know more about this, then actually the CRUK website has got a fantastic resource. So you can go to the link I've put it down here, and you can click on the different types of breast cancer and you can learn more about them. Now, most women will have an invasive breast cancer of no special type. I mean, that is probably about 80% of all breast cancers. So most people will fit into that category, and all these others occur in minority. The one that many women are particularly interested in is triple negative breast cancer. And what this means is that most breast cancers express little receptors in the breast cancer cells for estrogen, progesterone, and something called Herceptin, HER2. And this helps guide therapy, and that's why it's important. So estrogen receptors tend to be hormonally responsive, and you can block these receptors with different drugs, and that can then be part of the management of a breast cancer. So this is a very standard thing. Every breast cancer will get typed for these three markers. Many will get typed for more markers, but this is really the key ones that we get typed for. And over the last sort of 10, 15 years, doctors and researchers have realized that there are certain subtype or triple negative that don't express any of these three types of receptor. And people have been able to target specific drugs, particularly at these types of breast cancers. They seem to behave a bit differently to the ER positive breast cancers, and they seem to respond to different drugs. So that's why this has become particularly important. Now, there are other also, as well as these subtypes, you can divide them up further, and there are many different targeted treatments, which is beyond the scope of this talk. So here, I'm really interested in the ER positive versus the triple negative. And for a long time, we didn't really know where PALB2 fitted with this. And what's happened is that there's been a really nice new study that came out earlier this year in January. And this is a very large study. So you can see that over 40,000 women were involved with breast cancer. So they compared 40,000 women with breast cancer, and they compared that to a similar number of women who didn't have breast cancer. And they had all the genetic sort of data on these women as well. So that we're talking about hereditary mutations, pathogenic variants, hereditary alterations in the gene. And PALB2 is often compared to BRCA1 and BRCA2. And it's been known for a while that women who carry BRCA1 gene alterations in particular have a very high risk of triple negative breast cancer. And you can see that from this graph. So this is basically showing you the age of a woman and the risk of getting a particular type of breast cancer over the course of that age. And you can see that BRCA1 is by far and away carries the highest risk. So about 40% of BRCA1 carriers will get a triple negative breast cancer by the age of 80. So people have always wondered about PALB2 and actually the data shows that it's very similar to the BRCA2 gene, and it's higher than non-carriers. Okay, so the rate of triple negative breast cancer is a bit higher than what you see in the general population, but it's nowhere near the same level that you see in BRCA1. So I think that gives us quite a nice answer about this, really. And if you want to look at the proportions, so at any age, about 17% of breast cancers will be triple negative in the PALB2 population versus about 11% in the general population. And if you look at the under 40, so younger women, nearly 20% of PALB2 carriers will be triple negative versus 16% in the general population. So this is very useful information. I think it tells us clearly that there is an increased instance or increased chance that a PALB2 breast cancer will be triple negative compared to general population, but it's nowhere near as high as what you see in BRCA1. Now, The same study also looked at the more common hormone ER positive, estrogen positive breast cancer. And here we could see that actually, as you'd expect, BRCA1 is low on this because many more of them are going to be the triple negative type. And you can see that BRCA is high, and PALB2 is also following BRCA2 more than it is BRCA1. And so again, this is evidence that I think you could pretty much put PALB2 and BRCA2 together in terms of breast cancer types, and you could say that they're quite different to BRCA1. Okay, so that was the first thing I wanted to talk about. The second thing I wanted to run through with you was something called missense gene alterations in PALB2, and I'm going to explain this in a bit more detail. And this is particularly, again, a question that I often get asked when I get emails about particular changes in the PALB2 gene that have been reported. So just a brief refresher. So genes are like sentences in a chapter, and chromosomes are like chapters in a book. So we're really focusing on the genes, and you have 2 copies of every gene. You get one from a mother, one from a father. And the genes themselves are made out of letters of DNA. There are 4 letters of DNA, A, C, G, and T, and they are read in little groups of 3 like this. And this is actually the code for the starting code for PALB2. And you can, so these are the very first letters in the PALB2 gene here, and you can see how it's read in little groups of 3. And each group of 3 codes for what's called an amino acid, which is a building block that helps, and it's really an instruction for the cell itself. So let's think about these groups of 3, and I've actually made a sentence here, which is made out of, it's specifically made out of words that have 3 letters. So the cat ate the rat, and this would be a normal sentence. Everyone, that makes sense. Everyone can understand it. For many, clearly mutated or altered genes, alterations in the PALB2 gene, you get what's called a nonsense, which is where you get a full stop in the wrong place. So here, the sentence says the cat ate, doesn't make, or the cat ate, doesn't make any sense at all. It's not going to help the cell. It's not, it's not going to help anyone. And that actually is, many of you will have this particular mutation. This is the most common one in PALB2. And you can see at position 3113, there's a letter G to letter A, and that causes a full stop in the gene there. So this is an example of this type of change in the gene. Now you get other changes. So for example, you can have an extra letter added, but the cell still reads it in groups of 3. So again, it makes no sense afterwards. And on the other side, you can have a letter removed. So here the letter T is removed, everything's shifted up 1, but again the cell is reading it in groups of 3, doesn't make any sense. And these are all clearly, when we see these in the laboratory, we know for sure that the PALB2 gene is not going to be working properly, and we know that this is going to be causing a problem, an increased risk of breast cancer and some of the other cancers. Now, missenses, this is where we get a missense. So here, what's happened is one of the letters has changed. So here the letter R has changed to letter B. The cat ate the bat. Does that make sense? Well, it might do, but we're not really sure. It doesn't make as much sense as this, but maybe that's still an instruction that the cell can read. And this is where we end up with a lot of problems, because often this could just be a normal rare variation that we haven't seen before. Alternatively, it could actually be a true mutation, something really that's affecting the function of the gene. And sometimes it's really difficult to tell whether it's rare, normal variation, or really causing a problem. And we spend a lot of our time dealing with these challenges, because actually, there is quite a lot of variation in our genetic code, and so it's not unusual to see, differences to the code, the standard code that we use as a comparison. So what happened was that there was a big study, again published this year, and you can see, you can see how many people are involved with these sorts of studies, and this will be from all over the world, and that's the nature of the research that we do. It's highly collaborative, and we work with many, many different people across many time zones, many parts of the world, and that's partly why it happens quite slowly as well, because to get everyone to do everything, they're all busy people anyway. To get people to do everything that you want them to do, for the usually, well, it's for free. They're doing it for free, and they're doing it in their goodwill. They're doing it because they're interested, but still, everyone's busy. So it's hard to, get this going properly. And that is the skill of trying to do an international collaboration. So what they showed was they looked at BRCA1, and this is what the actual the protein, which is the function, which is the end product of the gene, looks like. So they looked at this, and they saw that there are certain areas where the points in dark blue or black here are clearly causing a problem in the gene. These are these missense variants. So you can see that in a gene like BRCA1, you do get these in certain positions in the gene, not everywhere, but in certain places. Now they looked at PALB2, and you can see there's no black dots anywhere here on this one compared to BRCA1, where you get these black dots. Not many, but you get some. Here you get none at all. And what this is telling us is that the likelihood that a missense change in PALB2 is actually disrupting the gene is actually going to be very low, because it seems to be very rare, and it seems much more likely that these are just rare normal variations. So when you get a missense change in PALB2, it's often called a variant of unknown significance, but actually the most likely outcome is that it's going to be just a benign normal change and not disease causing. So I think that's an important piece of information that would help us interpret results as we go forward. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to mention was some new updates on some UK guidelines on ovarian cancer. And we basically know that there is a small increased risk of ovarian cancer and PALB2. And the study that we did, we thought this risk was about 5% to age 80. There was another study that thought it was about 3% to age 80. The truth is probably somewhere in between that, between 3 and 5%. But both studies showed that the risk below the age of 50 is very low indeed. So you have to look at the scale here. It's certainly less than 1% in both studies. So not much to worry about before the age of 50. Even after the age of 50, the risk is quite low compared to other genes like BRCA1 and BRCA2. And so where does this put PALB2 on the scale of all the genes that cause ovarian cancer? Well, BRCA1 and BRCA2 are right up here. They're again the most important ones that cause ovarian cancer. And you can see that then there's some other genes, and then PALB2 really sits on the right on the line according to, is it going to actually benefit? Is there a benefit to taking the ovaries out or not? So this is really still very much an area of controversy. And so what we had a big meeting about this. These are, again, lots of people involved, everyone from the UK, all from the UK genetic centres. And these were the things that we came up with, the recommendations. So we said that ovarian surveillance should not routinely be offered. And that's because we know it's not effective in reducing the risk of death from ovarian cancer. And the management should be based on individualized risk. So we shouldn't just give the same advice to everybody. We should look at each person, each woman, and give them and decide, based on their individualized risk, what we would recommend. And the lifetime risk for that person should be over 5%, and it should only really be considered at 5% at 50 years or older. So that's really where I wanted to finish with, those three important developments in the gene. I'm going to finish there, just so that one of the questions was, how can I help PALB2 research? Well, you can certainly, we do collect data on families through the PALB2 website. You can contact us directly, email here, or there's a link through the website. We also work with the Embrace study, that's a UK study, where we're collecting data as well. So the more data we are able to collect from you, the better we are able to answer the questions that you're asking us. And with that, I'd like to finish. Thank you.
Thank you so much. One question I have is, I've seen a number of studies posted either through FORCE or come up in a group of joining Canadian study, US study.
Yeah.
Are they all brought together?
Yes,
there's no duplication.
We all share data. So it's all completely anonymous as well.
Mm-hmm.
So that's an important point. So you may, even if you share more personal data like dates of birth, we don't share that. We move it to a year of birth. So we take out the date of birth. It's just a year, and there's no names or anything like that involved. So it just becomes some data that we have that's anonymous. Can't be traced back to you, but we then share it with other collaborators to. That's the only way to actually get enough numbers together to have some meaningful results.
Thank you very much. So if you've got any questions, please do post in the chat. And I think we'll move on to Joanna. Joanna, over to you and welcome.
Hi, hello everybody. Thank you for inviting me to talk. So I think the context here is a story of a PALB2 carrier and what happened to me and what I've done about it in my way. So just a little bit about myself. I'm an artist filmmaker and a professor of filmmaking at the University of Sussex. I was born in Australia and all my family live there. I have 4 sisters. I was diagnosed at 47 with breast cancer, and this came after my sister at 47 also had breast cancer. At that time, there was no, I wasn't tested for the BRCA. I wasn't eligible for it because of the family history, even though my mother also had breast cancer but developed it quite late. So I was treated for breast cancer with a lumpectomy and radiotherapy. And then by a sort of amazing coincidence in Australia, my sister's DNA was randomly tested for PALB2, and she was found to be a carrier. And therefore I was tested here, and I was also found to be a carrier, although my 3 other sisters don't carry the gene, and my mother doesn't either. It came from my father's side. So at that moment, I began to consider my options, and I actually went to Guy's Hospital and I visited the staff there, and I was considering a preventative mastectomy. But in my mind, I thought, well, I've had it once. It's not likely that I'm going to get it again. That was sort of my thoughts. But very sadly, I did develop a lump. And this time, of course, I made the decision to have a double mastectomy, which was offered to me because of my gene history and my cancer history. And I had treatment that was in November 2020. So I had a double mastectomy with a tissue reconstruction using my thighs. I had 3 months of chemotherapy, Herceptin. I had my ovaries out. I was over 50. I have Zolmeter and Letrozole, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But in August 2021, I was given the all clear. It was a very long journey, a very difficult journey, and many of you perhaps know about that. But I'm well now, and I decided to do something with this experience that I had. I mean, as a filmmaker, I'm very interested in telling stories and sharing stories. And with a second cancer diagnosis, I think your position is quite different from the first time. And I was aware that I was going to have this mastectomy regardless of what was going to happen. And so I began documenting my journey as a way to occupy myself, really. But because I knew what was happening was really going to be a life-changing event. So I've been doing that since November 2020. But I didn't want this story to only be about myself and my experience. I wanted it to be a story about recovery as well. And I wanted it to be a story about breasts and our feelings towards them when we're faced with losing them. So I wanted to break some taboos about mastectomies themselves. I think there are conversations being had about breast cancer, but I still feel that a mastectomy is something that sometimes is a bit covered over. It's a difficult thing to talk about. But I wanted to try to break some of those taboos around mastectomies. And so I've made a film. I've just finished production of the of a section of it, and it's called Goodbye Breasts, and it's a hybrid documentary. That means it mixes fiction and fact to explore what our breasts mean when we're faced with losing them. And so I consider breasts in a number of different ways. I speak with women, other women, and I do interviews with women about their breast experiences. I look at the role that breasts have played in our culture and historically. And I also undertake a rather kooky and strange adventure to build a giant inflatable boob, and which you can enter and encounter your breast anatomy. And the size of this breast is about 9 meters by 5 meters. And inside is this sort of colorful world, which has lobules and milk ducts and fat cells and lymphatic system, all the kinds of things you start to learn about when you go through something like this. You become much more aware of your breasts and actually of how amazing they are. So the size of the breast is really a symbol of how big an issue breasts can be. And I used this sort of playful approach in a way to open audiences to what can be difficult content. It's not to trivialize it at all. It is my experience. But it's a way to allow conversations to be had, and also to recover ideas about how to sort of challenge ideas about how we recover from illness. Because as many of you may know, many of us will get cancer, regardless if you're a gene carrier or not. And I believe that we need more stories about life after cancer as well, and the ways that it's possible to recover from this. And, I think it's important to emphasize that a mastectomy is a life-saving operation. Even though it's a huge thing to undergo, it is something that can save your life. So my project works with, as I said, women on interviews. We've done workshops. We wrote a pop song about having a mastectomy, and we recorded a music video. So the whole project is a very kind of playful, colorful film and project about breasts. It's about my personal story, which was difficult, and there are difficult moments in it, but it's also trying to be a way to open up conversations. So my website, I think it's online there. You can go and look at it, and I'm happy to answer any questions if you want to email me. But I hope that's a story, a bit of a story about how it is possible to recover from breast cancer or from a mastectomy, and to perhaps take life into your hands in a way that you might not have thought to do so before. So thank you.
Oh, Joanna, wonderful, so moving, and can't wait to see the film. I love the bit about life after cancer, because we hear less about that, and that's certainly very important. Thank you so much for sharing your story. Wonderful. Okay, shall we move to Donna? Donna, you're on mute, Donna. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, here we go.
Joanna, that was amazing. I really want to see the large breast. Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak today, and also for this entire platform. I mean, there really hasn't been anything like it, so thank you for everything. So a bit about me. I'm 39, and I have been working in women's health and menopause, ironically. And literally 2 years ago to around literally this time, I was diagnosed with breast cancer, and it was in the midst of hardcore COVID. So it was quite difficult to navigate the healthcare system, as you can imagine. And I was once I did go for testing, I was quite quickly diagnosed. And, my surgeon made the right decision to absolutely move quite quickly to a lumpectomy. Surgery schedules were quite challenging at the time, so we just moved very, very quickly. But at that time, I also did pause and say, actually, I'm quite young here. And, we did have a little bit, and we do have a little bit of ovarian cancer. So I did ask about genetic testing. I'm so glad I did, because actually it's come to light very recently. There was actually a bit of a blind spot with further breast cancer in a family that we didn't know about. And I don't think it's an uncommon thing. So I'm really glad that I did ask for genetic testing, and actually was referred to the amazing Dr. Callaghan, who's on this platform. So she was fantastic with me and very promptly diagnosed me with the PALB2 mutation, which was great to know. But I think, like a lot of people, when you find it out at the point of diagnosis, you've got all these options, fertility out the window. It was all this, it was just so challenging. And I was just about to embark on chemotherapy. So I had every intention to then have further surgery because I'd had 2 lumpectomies, but I had every intention to have further surgery and do a double mastectomy and reconstruction after chemotherapy, because actually for me it was going to be not only a treatment because I wouldn't require radiotherapy, but also prevention for a new cancer. So it was a no-brainer, right? But then I did chemotherapy and I was scrambling around trying to see consultants and do Zoom meetings with surgeons to find out my options. And I didn't take so well to chemotherapy. I did have to have some adjustments. It was tough on me. So when I got the other side with full intention, the facts were there. And I've made some pretty big decisions in my life to date. And it was like I was paralyzed. I genuinely was paralyzed in my decision making. It was like, it makes sense to do this, but it's like my body could no longer do any more at that time. And I think this is really where the kind of mental and the kind of emotional well-being aspect really comes into this. And I had a time constraint, as I'm sure many of you know, where I had to make a decision, because if I didn't do it, I'd then have to have radiotherapy. So I had this time crunch, and I just remember going to the beach one day. I think I'd literally chewed everyone's ears off about this. I think everyone was fed up. Is Donna having a mastectomy or is she not? And then I went to the beach, and I just literally had to blow away the cobwebs. And I think it was like my heart almost spoke to me and said, I just can't do anything more right now. And and I think that's a decision that I've most certainly had to be kind to myself about now. And I definitely, invite others to be as well, because, it's very challenging when you go through a gene mutation diagnosis alongside a cancer diagnosis. It's tough. So I'm being kind to myself. So I obviously didn't have a double mastectomy at that point. I had the radiotherapy. And then fast forward, what we did do is cascade testing to the family pretty quickly to find out where it come from. And it was on my mother's side, and my younger sister, Jade, who's joining us here tonight, she was diagnosed with PALB2, and I'm so, proud of how well she took it. She, digested the information, and she made a very swift, very brave decision. That's it. I'm having a double mastectomy and reconstruction. I'm doing it now. So she really just has gone for it, and she's actually 6 weeks post her surgery. She's done really well, and couldn't be really prouder of where she is now, and she feels really happy with her decision. So so that's wonderful. And I think what we've recognized is obviously my journey has enabled Jade to make an informed decision and to process it and then decide what she wanted to do. And what I think our goal really is, as a kind of a mission, is that we don't really want anyone to have to reach a point of diagnosis to find out that they have a gene mutation. So that's really our vision. And from that, we've made an initiation of not just BRCA, which is started off as an Instagram page. We've launched out there as media. We have a number of lineup events coming up and national TV to really talk about the message of actually, I think mainstream people do know about BRCA, which is great, but actually PALB2 and other gene mutations that are out there. And, for everyone to be self-advocates of their own health, to find out about their family history, and to if there's concerns, to be led towards a pathway to genetic testing. So our primary goal, first of all, is to really get public awareness out there, which has started, and we're working with a number of different parties. And then secondly, the second pillar is to really help to continue to close that knowledge gap, and also the gap of access to genetic testing, and to just make it something that through fundraising and other mechanisms to just help to make this something that's more talked about, and to really help no one ever to have to go through this journey without knowing about it, and at least making an informed decision. So that's what we're doing. And we don't, we certainly don't see this as like our initiative. It's everyone's initiative, and we want really everyone to be involved, because there's essentially so much work to do. So that's what we're doing. So thank you for listening to our story, and we look forward to kind of getting involved with all of you. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Donna. Can't wait to see you on TV representing all of us. And we're wishing very well to Jade with her recovery. Certainly, what I found is when I was diagnosed, as I wanted to speak to someone like me, and I found them in Canada. I couldn't find anyone in the UK, and it brought me back into UK afterwards. And I'm so glad that we have this now community, can reach out, to Joanna, me, Donna, Marc, Andrew, and there is someone you can talk to always, whether it's emotional side or experience, etc. We have so many of us sadly around, it's actually good news way around, but around with PALB2 mutation or other mutations, and certainly the awareness, particularly October, the Breast Cancer Awareness Month, is up there. So let's spread the word. And that takes me to the next page, Marc. Thank you so much, Donna. Next page, where I just listed also, if we do have Susan Berger on the call, who is a journalist and a fellow PALB2 carrier from the US. She started off the campaign last year, and has gone national TV, national newspapers in the US. And that was really a raised up amount of people who went for genetic testing and found out they had a gene, PALB2 or other. And also there are others here also been quite vocal, myself here. That was me promoting the first PALB2 session with breast cancer now 2 years ago, and I'm glad it's taking further and further, and our voice is getting heard, but there's much more to do. So well done, Susan, Donna, Joanna, and everyone for keeping it up. So we're gonna move to Q&As now. So we received 18 questions, and some came on the chat as well. We'll start off with those that have arrived. I know some of them are, you will hear more on the questions that you're asking us in the chat through the Q&As we're going to cover now. If we move to the next slide, so you will see me playing up with animations, but they will fall. Here we go. So the question number 1 about the cancer, not just breast occurrence rate without a risk-reducing mastectomy versus the reoccurrence rate after mastectomy. I understand that the PALB2 gene helps with DNA repair, and cancer develops if too many DNA strands cannot be repaired. So this would be hold true regardless of whether we have a risk-reducing mastectomy or not. I'm wondering if cancer simply occurs, occupies other tissues if the breasts aren't there anymore, hence the reoccurrence, i.e. in lymph nodes. That's a question for Andrew.
Yes, so lots of things to cover in that question, actually, Yulia. So I suppose the key distinction to make is that when we're thinking about recurrence rate, are we thinking about recurrence of a previous cancer, so a cancer that you've already had and has come back, or are we thinking about a new primary cancer developing? And that's a really very, very important distinction to make. So what we know is that if you're a PALB2 gene mutation carrier, that there's a risk, and you've had breast cancer, then there is a risk of a new primary breast cancer in any remaining breast tissue. And that risk of a new primary breast cancer is higher than somebody who doesn't carry a gene mutation. What determines your recurrence risk in terms of your previous cancer is not so much the PALB2 gene mutation, but actually the type of breast cancer you had, the stage at which it was diagnosed, the type of treatment that you had, your response to that treatment, all of those other factors, chemotherapy, radiotherapy, and your response to all of that. So there are two different distinctions, and that's a very important distinction. So when people say to me, is my risk of recurrence higher with a PALB2 mutation, I can tell you about your risk in relation to a new cancer developing, either, albeit, breast cancer or ovarian cancer. But actually, in terms of recurrence of your previous cancer diagnosis, that is something that your oncology team will be able to guide you depending on the stage, etc., of that cancer. Does that answer the question, I hope, Yulia?
I think so. Thank you. If we have the author of the question on the call, they can add.
Yeah, if whoever asked that is on the call, then hopefully that did answer the question.
Okay. Shall we move to the next question? I would love to learn more about more males testing for positive for PALB2. My son has it.
Yes, so for men, there are no significant, or the implications are very much smaller than for women. And certainly for young men, nothing to worry about. We know that there is a small increased risk of male breast cancer but again, that's mainly later on in life. And we know there's a small increased risk of pancreatic cancer of both sexes. And these are just in the order of, 2 or 3% increased risk, and maybe 1% increased risk of male breast cancer. So very low risks. And you can mitigate, certainly for the pancreas cancer risk, by leading a healthy lifestyle, not smoking, not drinking excessively. So these will all put your overall cancer risk in your favor. And the only other issue with males is, of course, that they can't pass it on to their daughters. So there are options available there, and they can seek genetic advice if they don't want to pass this on to the next generation.
Thank you. What do we know about people with PALB2 mutation who do not develop breast cancer? Is there anything we can learn from them to lower our risk?
Let's go first, Sanjay.
Yes, so I suppose that's information that we're gathering, and Marc and many of those researchers are looking at is actually what other genetic factors, lifestyle factors, environmental factors influence our risk. We know that carrying a gene mutation isn't the whole story. It increases risk, but there are other factors that are going to influence whether disease manifests or not. And that is an area that is still growing and that we're still researching. And as Marc said, in terms of the collaboration internationally and studies like the EMBRACE study, for example, these are really key endeavours that will garner that data and that information. And it is harder with PALB2 because it is rarer than BRCA1 and BRCA2. So that international collaboration is really key. Marc, is there anything that's come out of the data so far in this area that you can share?
It's still early days, I think, certainly for the EMBRACE study in the UK. There's also an equivalent study in North America called iCare. So those of you who are involved, and other studies in Australia as well. So you can find a study in most countries that are interested, and then we pull the data, as I said before. And yeah, I think you're completely right. I mean, the vast majority of women will not develop ovarian cancer with this gene, with the PALB2 gene mutation, but a few will. And again, the vast majority will not develop pancreatic cancer, but a tiny proportion will. So what is it in those women that's protecting them against these other cancers? So these are great questions that we are still working on, and certainly collecting the data will give us some insight.
Thank you very much. Let's move to the next page. Okay, so this is the question that also came through the chat. I think a couple of people asked about pancreatic cancer, pancreatic screening. What's the protocol for pancreatic screening that should be in the UK?
Yeah, so this is a very controversial question, and there's also someone in the chat has also brought this up. There's a recent paper in Journal of Clinical Oncology about screening or surveillance for pancreatic cancer. I think the opinion is still very much divided about this. The pancreas is an organ quite buried inside the abdomen. It's difficult to get good surveillance on, and also some of the surveillance that you can do can cause complications in itself. So there are some risks there can be some risks to the surveillance depending on what you do. And I would say that even in the light of the new publication, there are still some issues with that publication, some of the issues with the data, how it was collected, and how it was interpreted, that some experts disagree with. And I personally still think that this is something that should be done as part of a research study. I don't think it's ready to be done as a routine. I don't think we should be offering it as a routine service. If people want it, then they can join a research study. And to be eligible for that, you have to have a relative who's been affected with pancreatic cancer. So just having the PALB2 mutation by itself isn't enough. You need that plus a close relative affected with pancreatic cancer. And that is run through a centre in Liverpool. It's called the EuroPac study, but they also have collaborative centres elsewhere, certainly in London as well. And I think we still don't really know how effective this screening is. As a comparison, there's been a lot of work done on surveillance screening for ovarian cancer, and we know that even though the surveillance may pick up the cancer a little bit earlier, the ovarian cancer, it's not picking up early enough to prevent death from ovarian cancer. And that is really the critical measure. So many of the studies on these types of screening, they don't collect data on the actual final outcome. They report their results sooner than that. And it's actually, when you look at, is this actually saving lives? That is the real question that you need to ask. Not, is it detecting pancreatic cancer earlier? Is it actually saving lives by doing it? That's the key question, and that still is uncertain.
And can I just add to that, Yulia, that it's also about, are we doing more harm by screening as well? Because, as Mark's rightly said, some of the interventions, when you find something and you biopsy it in the pancreas, that can be very dangerous. So, for example, there was a study about screening for neuroblastoma in children over in the Far East a long time ago, where they actually did more harm to those children by screening for neuroblastoma, those children having unnecessary interventions. So it is just about getting that balance right. And I think in the UK, we are quite keen on the evidence base being really robust before we put these sort of screening measures in place. Hope that was okay to add that, Mark.
Yeah.
Okay, the next question is, how do percentages of risk in breast cancer increase, remain the same with each generation impacted? Actually, let's talk about the male example here, father.
Yes.
Pancreatic, yeah.
So I think, so there are some conditions where we see, some genetic conditions where we see what we call anticipation, which is where you get earlier onset, more severe disease happening at younger ages with progressive with next generations, but that's not necessarily the case for cancer predisposition genes like PALB2. And what you're describing here is a difference in what we call penetrance, and that will be different depending on the tumor type and depending on other risk factors like we talked about. There are many things that influence somebody's risk of developing cancer. The PALB2 gene mutation is one element, but then there might be protective genetic factors, there might be protective hormonal factors or lifestyle factors for that individual as well. And it's really that multifactorial element that plays a part for every individual in the family. And each individual in the family is going to have a different genetic makeup that will also influence that as well. So I don't think you can say that it necessarily increases or decreases. It's going to be specific to that individual, what their risks are. And our ability to predict that is still evolving. We know that there are other genetic factors like polygenic risk that probably play a component in whether disease manifests as well.
Yeah, and there was another last question in this category. If you click again, Mark, get to question 6. Yeah, what are your thoughts on the recently updated NCCN guidelines, the ovarian cancer management, which now say consider the risk saving salpingo-oophorectomy? Did I correctly say that? Over the age 45.
Yes. I mean, I think that if we're talking specifically about removing the tubes, that's a slightly different question. If this is removing the ovaries and the tubes, then I mean, we're saying 50, 45, around about the menopause, the age of the menopause. I think that seems reasonable. But again, I think it depends a bit on, it's not for everybody. If you come from a family where there's absolutely no history of ovarian cancer, then maybe your risk is going to be much lower. We also know that if you've taken the contraceptive pill at a young age for more than 3 years, that probably reduces your risk of ovarian cancer by about half. And that we know that's true in the general population. It's probably true for carriers of genes like BRCA1, 2, and PALB2 as well. So there's other factors that come into play here. But again, just to emphasize that these risks are low, and we see that subjectively. I've looked at lots and lots of family trees of PALB2 families, and you don't see much ovarian cancer. It's really not a very prevalent cancer in these families.
Thank you. Yeah, the next set of questions, I think that's correct, is with diagnosis and treatment.
Okay.
What's the recommended course of treatment for different types of breast cancers? And is there a type of breast cancer that is more common with PALB2, which is what
so I've sort of answered this. I mean, the course of treatment will be guided by your oncologist, and it can be quite precise to the type of breast cancer. As I said before, there are lots of different types of breast cancer, and they're increasingly, as we understand them better, we're dividing them up more and more. and they can be quite different diseases. And as there are types of breast cancer that's more common, well, I did point out that the triple negative is slightly more common compared to the general population, but the majority of breast cancers in PALB2 will be estrogen positive.
And the next question is, I would also like to know the average age of women with PALB2 with breast cancer, or choose to have a double mastectomy before 50 with no breast cancer.
Yeah, it's not really dependent on the age. It's often dependent on the circumstances of that individual person. It's a personal decision. And, you know, as we heard with Donna and Jay's story, it's very much about when maybe the diagnosis is, when the gene is identified, that's when the decisions are made. You can't make the decisions if you don't know the gene exists in the family. So there isn't really an average age. And it can be done, you know, in young women in their 20s or in older women. I think if you're getting to women in their 60s and 70s, the benefit is probably, you know, the risk of the surgery may outweigh the benefit. And also, if you've got other medical conditions at that point, you know, you may also, you know, the benefit may not be there. So these are very personal decisions, essentially, and there's no average age.
And the last question here, can PALB2 be renamed into BRCA3 or BRCA3? Because there are so many more drugs that are approved for BRCA, not fast enough for PALB2. Yeah,
I mean, we know there aren't any other major breast cancer genes. We've looked, you know, very hard at this, and you know, PALB2 is the third most important gene after BRCA1 and BRCA2, but it is quite a long way third. You know, so BRCA1 and BRCA2 is still the most important, and then comes PALB2. It's not easy to change the name in the world of science. You know, PALB2, I think, is going to stick, but in the in the general public's terms, I mean, it could be called BRCA3 if people wanted to, and you know, people can call it that. It doesn't. I can see the logic behind it, but people might argue against it as well.
Not for now.
And I think awareness is really growing that it isn't, in terms of PARP inhibitor use, that it is broadening beyond BRCA1 and 2 anyway, in the sense of any genes that are involved in that particular pathway that could lead to the genetic defect that we call HR deficiency. HR deficiency in itself is kind of being looked at in trials as an indication for PARP inhibitors anyway. So I think we may even move beyond this sort of it has to be a specific gene, to actually, what is the problem with the biological pathway, and does that justify PARP inhibitor treatment? So hopefully we won't need to get to the point of needing to change the name.
The next question was on, okay, for someone who is having risk-reducing surgery, would be the combined pill be recommended post-mastectomies to protect the ovaries?
So presumably, so you're talking about someone who's had breast risk-reducing surgery. I mean, like Marc says, we know that the oral contraceptive pill does have a risk reduction effect. Again, it would depend on the individual, would depend on their age, you know, and all the other factors. So in theory, you know, the combined oral contraceptive we know protects against ovarian cancer. When your risk, again, is a few percent, what real benefit you get from that needs to be very clearly balanced for that individual, I think, because whether you're really going to get such a significant risk reduction that it warrants that or not is for, I think, an individualized discussion with the team that's involved in your care. And presumably, again, has the woman got a history of cancer, or is there anything else that we need to take into account when we're thinking about that additional treatment as well?
Thank you. Okay, so there's one question on variants, and we had quite a few of the discussion in the group actually before. I'm curious about how specific variants are being tracked and how we can stay up to date on our variants aside from doing the occasional clinical search.
Yeah, so that's a good question. I mean, most variants, if you've got like one of the obvious, you know, clearly mutations that are affecting the gene, as I illustrated before, then nothing much is going to change. We know what they cause. We know they're causing a problem. You know that all what will happen is that we'll find more and more cases, similar cases. If you're talking about sort of the ones where we're not sure, like the variants of unknown significance, well, you can track. I mean, the easiest way to track them actually is to just Google the number that you get with it and see what comes up. And there's a particular website called ClinVar, which is where lots of laboratories deposit their data, and that's worth checking from time to time. And that's an American website run by the National Institute of Health in America, and that's sort of the go-to place where we go if we want to quickly see, you know, what the current status is with a particular variant. And but things don't change quickly, so you know, maybe you don't need to check it every week. You know, it might change from one year to the next. So changing every couple of years, I think, is perfect. Checking every couple of years is perfectly reasonable. You can also contact your local genetics service and say, you know, hey, you saw me back in 2015, you found this, are there any new updates? And then they should be able to get back to you. And that's probably the better way of doing it, to be honest.
Okay, there was a question in the group to do with the PALB2 binding sites. Do you see differences in cancer risk or tumor or survival rates between mutations in different PALB2 binding sites?
Yeah, we had a look at this in the study we published a couple of years ago, but we didn't have enough numbers to actually come up with any definite difference. It's possible, but it's going to be quite hard to answer that question without doing much larger studies. And I think if the differences are there, they'll be quite small, and they may not be big enough to make any difference from a clinical point of view.
Thank you. The next set of questions, for quite a few of them actually links to other cancers, which is quite a popular topic of Q&As. If you have had one type of cancer with PALB2, are you more likely to have another, either same type or different?
So, I mean, if you've had a breast cancer, you are more likely to get another new breast cancer. Not talking about recurrence, we're talking about a new breast cancer. And particularly if you had a breast cancer at a young age, then there's a higher likelihood that you will get another breast cancer, and that's because you're expected to live a longer period of time, of which you might get that diagnosis. So I think that's true for breast cancer, that the risk will be a bit higher. But if you've had breast cancer, that's not going to impact on your risk of ovarian cancer or pancreatic cancer. So those are going to be independent. And likewise, if you've had pancreatic, that's not going to influence, you know, the ovarian or the breast. So I think, you know, that really just applies to the breast cancer side of things.
Yeah, next question is actually what we already talked, but can be covered again. What other cancers have been looked?
Yeah, we've just possibly
linked.
Yeah, we've looked at this, and as far as we can tell, well, we know there isn't going to be a big risk for a specific other cancer. We know, for example, that, you know, people who've got PALB2 mutations haven't got a high risk of bowel cancer, you know, because we would have definitely seen that. There's a question mark over stomach cancer, but I think the risk there, if it is true, will be quite a small increased risk, you know, maybe 1 or 2%. And likewise for other cancer types, these risks are going to be small, you know, just in the order of 1 or 2%. There's always a question mark about whether any of these, you know, whether cancers in childhood are increased. I think that's pretty unlikely. You know, there are some rare cases where you get children with PALB2 mutations, just with one mutation, and that could well be a chance association. That's going to take a long time to investigate further. And again, if there is an increased risk, it's not going to be a very big increased risk. So I think, you know, we can really stick with breast, ovarian, pancreas, are the main ones.
If you go through all the other questions, they will actually highlight the other cancers that everyone's asking about, the ovarian, which we talked about.
Okay.
And next one would have been the pancreatic one. The next one would be prostate, colon, bladder, gastric, and melanoma.
Yeah, I think prostate, maybe we didn't see any increased risk in our study. I think there's a bit of a question mark about it. Melanoma, we haven't seen that. Sometimes it's hard. Melanoma is quite common in the general population, particularly if you're from, you know, if you're from Australia. So sometimes it can be very hard to untangle these things when there are big lifestyle effects as well. But overall, I can be quite reassuring that we really are, you know, if there are any other risks, they're not going to be very big risks. And again, we see that in our family trees. You know, you do see other cancers, but they're just the common cancers that you see in any family, and we're not seeing anything particularly unusual.
Right. And then the last set of questions received was on new emerging research, or specific question asked about this particular one.
It's quite a technical question, this
Yes.
one. We certainly, I mean, as I've said before, we have 2 copies of a gene. We get one from our father, one from our mother. So far, the whole evening we've spoken about men and women who have 1 normal copy and 1 copy with a mutation, and that's what we call being a carrier. I think what this paper is referring to, or this study, is when you have both copies mutated. That's a very rare situation called Fanconi anemia, and that causes a childhood, that does cause cancers in childhood, but it's incredibly rare. There's probably less than a handful of such cases in the UK, for example, and probably less than 10 worldwide. And they have increased exposure to these sorts of chemicals, essentially. So we know there's some link there, but I don't think it's translated into what we're talking about tonight, which is really when you're a carrier with 1 normal copy of the gene. Because it seems that the normal copy of the gene can actually do a lot of the good work that these genes do.
And the last question there was to do with the UK, any studies in the UK which you have covered.
Yeah, it's really the EMBRACE study in the UK, iCare in North America, and then there's a study in Australia as well. And you can find these out through your local genetics service, regardless of which country you're in. Most countries will be offering you some research options. And I do encourage you to take part, because that's how we get, it's only through people before you that have committed to research that we're actually getting the answers that we can present here today.
Yeah, that completes, thank you so much, Mark. That completes, and Andrew, that completes our set of questions that received in advance. Just looking now at the chat and what questions been asked here. One of them is, why is the 10-year survival rate in literature so much lower when you have breast cancer plus PALB2 with PALB2 compared to sporadic breast cancer?
That, I think they're referring to one particular study that came out in Poland in 2015, and I think we need to wait whether or not that is correct. I mean, often when you get that sort of study, you then it needs to be repeated in other countries and other settings to see whether or not it's true. So at the moment, I'm not sure that is, I don't think we have enough evidence to say that that is correct. And it may well be not correct.
Okay, the next question is, would you think of ovary removal in a premenopausal woman with PALB2 breast cancer, which cannot take tamoxifen due to thrombosis risk?
Andrew, I don't know if you want to take that one.
Yes, I will. I can take that, and then I'm sorry, Yulia, I do have to head. But apologies, but yeah. I think it comes back to what Mark was saying about things being individualized, really, because we do need to take into account these elements as well. And if somebody is, I'm presuming that question is in relation to taking tamoxifen in terms of reducing risk of recurrence of a previous breast cancer diagnosis, as opposed to taking tamoxifen in a sort of chemo prevention setting for someone who hasn't had breast cancer. If it's in the first setting where somebody's had an estrogen receptor positive breast cancer, then I think actually removal of the ovaries and tubes at an earlier age is going to be beneficial in terms of reducing recurrence of the previous breast cancer. And we have had patients who choose that option premenopausally. Would you agree, Mark, with that? So I think that would be entirely reasonable. Apologies, I have to leave.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. I think a couple more here. It's about the average age of getting breast cancer with PALB2. And it seems to be more younger women are getting breast cancer with this gene. Is it true?
Well, it will, in general, the average age will be younger than the average age in general population, because that's what these genes cause. They do cause you to get the breast cancer at an earlier age. So that's true. But from one woman to the next, it's incredibly variable. Even within a family, it's incredibly variable. So not sure an average age helps that much, apart from to say that it is younger than the average age of breast cancer in the general population.
Okay. Is it reasonable to accept that PALB2 mutation carriers are more vulnerable to all cancers, given that our DNA repair machinery is compromised?
Yeah, you would have thought that, wouldn't you? Given that this is a fundamental part of the way the cell works, but it doesn't seem to be the case. We haven't found that, you know, we've only found links with certain cancers like ovarian and pancreatic cancer, and those links are very low. So clearly these genes are particularly important with certain types of tissue, certain types of organs in the body. And you see the same thing in BRCA1 and BRCA2, and they don't cause a generalized increased risk in cancer. It's only certain types of cancer. So I think our bodies are very resilient, and there are other mechanisms. If this particular repair pathway doesn't work, our cells and our bodies can use other repair pathways for, you know, many of the other organs in our body. But there seems to be particular issues with breast and a little bit with ovarian and pancreas.
Thank you. And there's an ask from Stacey. Would love to see more research focusing on the impact of exercise on reducing risk for PALB2 carriers and other lifestyle factors.
It's quite difficult to do because everyone tells you different things. If you ask someone how much exercise they do, they say, oh, they do a lot. And to actually measure it is quite difficult. So, but I think these days with, you know, lots of people wearing smartwatches or checking on their phones, it's become easier, and it's definitely something that people are interested in doing. And we're looking at that at the moment, particularly in BRCA1 and BRCA2, where the numbers are bigger, and hopefully at some point we can do that with PALB2. I think it's fairly clear that if you have a healthy weight and you exercise regularly, that protects you from breast cancer and other cancers as well. So I think that's what we need to strive for. And I know that's often easier said than done. And it's not very exciting advice, but that has stood the test of time, that bit of advice.
If you have deletion of chapters in your gene, does that put you at a higher risk for developing cancer versus just having a variation in your PALB2 gene?
It probably does. Again, it depends exactly what it's doing at that point. So it's a, you know, it's a bit more complicated than that. And we look at it from one variation in the gene to another variation. But yeah, in general, if there's a big chunk missing, you're much more likely to think that that's cause a problem.
So that's all the questions in the chat. I'm going to open up now to anyone on the call who would like to ask a live question. We can stop recording now.